The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
So hi, I'm Ed Hans, and allegedly a historian, and we're here today to take a quick walk, just an hour. Somebody keep track of the time because I'll babble on forever. Through the shovel shops, just to find out a little bit about how they used to work in the olden days. So I figured I'd start with a shovel, this is a terrible example of a shovel. It cost me $13. When, you can't get a meal for $13 these days, so you can imagine how bad this shovel is. It was probably made in Mexico. This is a perfectly bad example of a shovel. And it's the last process that was used here at the Ames Shovel Company. And this was a stamped shovel blade. So it's just one thin piece of sheet metal that was stamped into this shape, rolled over a handle, put in with two rivets, which will eventually, in the not too distant future, come loose, and a wooden handle. Wooden handles are sort of going out of fashion these days because wood's becoming more expensive. Fiberglass is a nice light replacement. And if you want a really serious shovel and have muscles, steel shafts are available. Why do I say this is a bad shovel? Because it's a shovel. It has a point on it. And it's pretty typical of what we see around here as a shovel. Other places have a rounder point. Some places have, in Europe, they use spades, okay? The difference between a shovel and a spade is that a spade has a square blade so that you can use it to make a nice edge, like you see here on the edge of the brick. We like our shovels with points on them here because it's New England, so you don't dig very far before you have a rock that you have to pry out of the ground. This is a bad shovel because it lacks lift. All right, so they're trying to make a compromise between a shovel and a spade. A spade always has a straight handle so that you can dig straight down and make a nice straight edge. Whereas shovels are usually made to lift stuff. And if there's a degree of lift here, it helps you to actually lift things off the ground and throw them in a wheelbarrow. This is too straight. It's much less than the 22 degrees that you usually see with a low lift shovel. It does have what we know now today to be the Ames bend, but they cheated on that too. The Ames bend, which was designed to provide lift to a shovel, actually put a bend in the handle. This cuts the handle, the wooden handle off here, and then has a bend in the metal plate. Which means eventually if I do any serious work with this, which it wasn't designed to do, it will just snap off. There's a story about old Oliver Ames when the boys decided to come up with a new version of a shovel. He got so mad at them that he came into the shovel shop and took a dozen shovels, put his foot on the blade and just snapped them like this. And I'm tempted to try that myself with this, but I knew what I spent $13 for. And if you go to Fernandes today, even their $30 shovels are what they call a hollow back shovel, which is not ideal for heavy work. The expensive shovels are much heavier, but we're going to learn the differences and how we ended up with this rather pathetic version of shovels as we walk through there. I also want to point out to start the day that in doing my research or redoing my research, I was looking at a diary of a shovel worker, and today on August 14th of 1850, William Loftus, an Irish immigrant, was killed in the shovel works, probably by being squished. Basically, there were a lot of machines there, many hammers, big ones and little ones, and you could very easily, not easily. If you were working a 12-hour day, it was much more likely that you were going to get tired and fall into a machine or stick your hand into a machine. And that's what happened on this day back in 1850. The diarist says, "I'll never forget the awful screams and groans of this boy as he took some time to die. He wasn't killed instantly." So it wasn't a safe place to work. All right. Does anybody have any questions so far? Would anybody like to buy this show? No. So the original shovel works was not on this side of the Shoveltown Pond. When Oliver Ames came here in 1803, there's a description which seems to be of the area in front of where the library was, which basically says there was so much tree growth and shrubbery that you could barely get through the lane when he came to look at this part of town. But on the other side, where Shoveltown Pond is today, there was a small factory that had gone bankrupt, which was perfect for him. He had just entered his 20s, had finished his apprenticeship with his brother, and maybe the Plimptons over in Walpole. And he was looking for a place to put into practice a new idea that he had. The idea was to make shovels in large numbers. So in order to do that, you needed water power. And so buying this little mill was ideal. We'll see that when we get towards the end of the tour. But what happened was in 1852, there was a huge fire that accidentally destroyed the shovel works. If you burn down my factory, I'm going to fire you. Patrick Quinn, the night watchman who burned down the shovel works, had a job at the shovel works for the next 50 years. So they weren't terribly mad at him, and they were partially insured. As a matter of fact, Oaks Ames is a part owner of the insurance company. So I'm not sure that they were terribly upset about the destruction of the original mill, because they had ideas to create this beautiful facility that we're going to go walk through. So follow me. This is a lovely spot to stop for ECAT, because you can't see what I'm going to be talking about. But you couldn't see it 5 years ago either. But through those shrubs, there's a building. And that's known as the Antrim Hammer Shop. It was built in 1864 to facilitate a new process that the Ameses were going to use to make shovels. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But between there and the wall here is a pond. And I do want to point out that old Oliver Ames did his best to control the water supply of the Queeset from Long Pond, where people go swimming, all the way down to right across the street from the NRT. And that would give him enough water power during the season to mostly run his mill. In the summertime, things might slow down a little bit. But so this pond here was originally a pond belonging to a blacksmith shop, perhaps the oldest industrial activity here in Northeastern, associated with this little Wild Dahlia building over here, which was run by the Randall people. So he bought all those things up and eventually used them for shovel production. What is the Antrim again? That's a very good question. Antrim is a small town in New Hampshire. My family actually lived there once upon a time. And a iron maker up there developed a process to weld steel to shovel blades. And basically, when you heat a piece of metal up, you change the temper of it, so you don't want to heat it too much. And the Antrim process heated a portion of a semi-finished product, like a handle, and then it could be welded on. Welding simply means pounded together. You think of welding today with the big mask and the no, welding in those days was you heat it up and you pounded it together. So steel straps were made in here that were then attached to steel blades over there. And what that meant was there were no rivets that had to be used. That's a cost saving. And supposedly, it gave you a stronger connection between the strap and the blade. Okay, so they bought that process. The Ameses didn't invent that process in 1864, just in time to get an order from the government to build the first entrenching shovels, the shovels we all call army shovels. Well, in the old days, they didn't fold, but they were about this long, and you could strap them on your back. And the first few thousand of them were made here, but just before the war ended. They did have some problems with the process getting it smoothed out, so they didn't make as many as they had hoped. And if you could find one of those today, it would be worth a lot of money. Okay. The Historical Society has a version of the Army shovel. The problem with shovels, and you'll find this out if you ever go to the Shovel Museum, is we don't date shovels, because the Ameses, when they made a shovel, no matter how archaic the design was, they would, if you wanted one, yeah, we'll make you one. It's 100 years out of date, but we'll make you one. And so it's almost impossible to date shovels, particularly if you have an antique that's been used, the labels have been torn away and all of this sort of stuff. So we can only kind of guess the age of a shovel. So the very first shovels that the Ames family made in their shovel factory, and they were still making it over here in the 1850s when they came over, was a iron shovel with a steel edge. And basically what they would do is they take a piece of metal the size of my hand and pound it into a shape where it was like two pieces, a shovel blade piece over here, a shovel blade piece over here, and an arm in between. And then they would essentially fold it over, which is way too much of a simplification. Fold it over, stick a little piece of steel, which would wear better, in the middle of it, and then hammer it into the shape of a blade. That required a lot of reheating. It's called forging, and there was a lot of work associated with it, which is why old Oliver got his idea. And I'll talk about the idea when we can see the buildings a little bit better. Basically, the buildings on the site here were built between 1852 and 1880. There are a couple that are more recent than that, and we'll see them towards the end of the tour. Anybody who's a competent blacksmith can make a shovel. Give me a hammer and a hot enough thing, I could even make a shovel, and I have no skill at all. Okay. Every member of the Ames family up to the parent of the current generation of Ameses could make a shovel. They were required to do that. That was family lore. So David Ames in 1935 made a shovel, and he was the last Ames to actually make a shovel. We always have to remember that in any large business, there's entrepreneurship where the bosses are hanging around and the guys that actually do the work. But the Ameses in a pinch, and sometimes not even in a pinch, could do the work. Old Oliver had started off basically in a little blacksmith shop making shovel blades. His perception was, wait a second, I've just apprenticed with my older brother. He was like 14 years older, and he was the superintendent of the Springfield Armory, and they were just about at the beginning of making interchangeable parts so that they could make hundreds and hundreds of muskets all the same and make them quickly. So he had learned that, oh, interchangeable parts, that's interesting, and division of labor. Instead of having a guy make an entire gun, you'd have somebody make the spring for the gun. Somebody else would make the lock for the gun. Other people would make the barrel. So nobody was making a whole gun anymore. He said, that's not a bad idea. We could do that with shovels too. And the process that I just described to you, which sounds so simple up there, is actually quite complex and has a number of steps to it. So he broke the steps down. And then he said, what are we going to do? I don't have a lot of blacksmiths. I have my friend Isa Waters, who's another blacksmith. And we can sit there and make shovel blades until the cows come home. And we can hire a kid named John Bisbee to make shovel handles. But we're never going to crank it up. So he thought this through and began to divide the process into semi-skilled things, stuff that you or I could do and learn very, very quickly, like hammering the outline of the original blade, shearing the excess metal around that. These were all steps that you could do. Ultimately, in this shop, there were 50 steps to make a shovel. So 50 or more people would work making every single shovel. And they could make them very, very quickly. They could make a shovel from raw metal to finished product in about 90 minutes. And that's only because setting up what we would consider to be an assembly line was not their number one priority. So there was some moving around of material that slowed things down. The other thing that slowed things down is that in most factories, by the time you got to the 1890s, you would have something called a yard engine, which would be sort of like a bobcat, you know, that you can get to do a little bit of work in your backyard. Well, a yard engine was a small locomotive that you could use to haul raw materials back and forth in the factory area. The Ameses never did that, apparently. They had oxen. And so the oxen were a feature. We have a number of pictures of them all the way through until the beginning of World War I, at least. And we have some descriptions of the girls. Girls would oftentimes be designated. They would get out of school for lunch, no school lunches. They'd run home. They'd grab their lunch. They'd grab their dad's lunch and bring it down to the shovel works. And they were terrified of these oxen because they're huge. They're also, you know, and they have big horns, but they're pretty gentle animals. But they never went to power, which is kind of weird, actually. So how did the process go? Well, after the original factory burned down, the Ameses built what is known as the long shop, which we'll see in a second. And at the same time, they built what's known as the hammer shop, and that's right here. This is the widest big building because they wanted to have as much floor space as possible, because we're talking about hammers that are driven by steam power that weighed several tons each, maybe 10 tons each. And they had a huge hammerhead, and they were used to shape the beginnings of the blades. Okay. So this is called the steam hammer shop. And if you come over here, when Beacon Projects put the apartments in here, we made them put the historic signs here, knowing that at some point I'm going to forget all this stuff. Yeah. I need these memory aids. So yeah, 7 to 12-foot wooden arms were going up and down, boom, boom, boom. They had a lot of impact on the town as well as on the shovel blades. You could hear these things for half a mile or more. So everybody who lived in this distance heard this pounding for hours every day. The other thing to note is that when they came over here, you know, why burn the shovel works down if we're not going to make some changes? Might have been the idea. They began to switch from water power to steam power. So this building was completely powered by steam. The buildings over here, right until the Ames family left in 1952, still had a water wheel, and we'll see that when we get to the other side. So there was steam power and water power. This was all steam power, and the little building in the back was where that big steam engine was located. And the steam engine worked on the same principle as the hammers. The arms went up, the arms went down. And it provided power to a long wooden pole that had leather straps attached to it. And the leather straps were so huge that there's actually a newspaper article talking about the construction of the leather strap. It was more than 1 cow long, that powered the main factory over here. Okay, so this was where the basic shaping of the shovels occurred. And then it says here plate polishing shops. The plate polishing shops are necessary because iron that's heated and cooled gets what's called scale on it. So they, in the early days, they would simply run a hose on it. But they also began to, in this era, have machines that would polish it by first applying sulfuric acid, and second, by neutralizing the sulfuric acid with lime, and then, polishing it with a machine. The bad part about that is that there was no environmental control at the time. So the storage facilities were right over there next to the stream. And in 1942, when the town did its first environmental survey, they noted that this part of the Queeset River was very polluted. And it's probably from the sulfuric acid that was put in there. So this is a good place to stop and look back this way. And what you see is the biggest building on that side is called the machine shop. It was a 3-story building. The top floor was for storage of raw material, lumber mostly, on the top floor. The second floor was the factory carpenter shop. And then the bottom floor was the machine shop that made new machinery and repaired the old machinery. And you can see there's large double doors like this one right here that allowed access into this area here. This was built in 1853 as part of the original process, and it was expanded fairly quickly, just like this shop was, to connect to this building here that says 1852 on the top. That's the long shop. And the long shop is the main production area and the big innovation that the Ameses came up with. And then over here on your right is another stone building. They all look alike, but they were, as I said, built over a 20-year period. The stone basically came from a quarry in back of what used to be the Council on Aging and now has another name, which I don't know. Anybody help me out? What do they call that? Yeah, we'll call it Frothingham Hall. That was the original name anyway. We'll call it Frothingham Hall. So there was a quarry in back there, much bigger than we originally thought, because the stone from here came from there, and the stone for some of our more famous buildings also came from there. So this one next door is the what was known as the storage area, and it had railroad tracks coming down on both sides. Ultimately, this complex became semi-obsolete, and in 1927 they hired Stone and Webster, which is even today a famous building company, to come in and do an analysis to see if they could change the flow of the process to be more efficient. So that went from being the handle shop, from being the storage shop to the handle shop where the handles were made. Attached to the machine shop is the original plate polishing shop, which makes sense. That's a logical way to do it. You're pounding these things, they're building up scale, you put them in there, it's next to the stream, so you have water, and you also have the acid and that sort of stuff. And then later in the 1880s, they thought this might be the last building they put on the site. They put in the new plate polishing shop. Okay, these were dangerous jobs because of the acid, but not as dangerous as others. There wasn't one set wage to be a shovel worker here in Easton. It depended on the job that you did, what you got paid, and most people got paid in piecework. To the best of our knowledge, until the 20th century, there was no strike for wages here. Hazel Varela, when I was a kid, said, "Oh, there was never a strike at the Ames factory." That's not quite true, but there never was a strike for wages until the 1920s. And that strike was settled very quickly by both sides agreeing to go to the state arbitration board, and that was taken care of. The Great Strike of 1889 was a big deal. It kept the works closed for several weeks, but that was all about piecework. It was the handlers over here had to go to a big box and pick out a blade to put a handle on. Well, some of them were a little bit off and would require more work to put the handles on. So this whole issue was, can I go and pick up all my stuff for all day? Or can I have to go for one and then another? And so they had this huge dispute. Shut the plant down. The Ames family handled it incredibly well, I think. Hobart Ames, the son of the president and the brother of Winthrop Ames, who lived in Queeset House, as did his dad, marched around town with his pistol in his pocket, making threats and stuff like that. The governor, who hadn't, the governor, he was still governor, said terrible things about unions and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the person who was really in charge, Oakes Andrew Ames, basically threatened, we're going to kick you guys out of these houses you're all renting from us, and if you don't go back to work. Well, that didn't work. They hired what even today are called scabs, and they were Swedish. Now, that's important because by this time in the 1889, a big chunk of the workforce was already Swedish. So they were not going to stick out like a sore thumb like some scab workers did. So ultimately what happens is they made an agreement and settled the strike. To this day, we don't know which side won. Okay. We do know that the Ameses made good on their threat. Oakes Andrew Ames refused to hire back 5 of the guys that had gone on strike. 5. One of them had already left town. 4 of them were hired by the Ames family to work in places other than the shovel works. They became gardeners and things like this. So nobody really suffered from this other than the fact that they were out of work for a few days. And I think Oakes and James did a wonderful job handling this. He lived on for another 10 years, and the shovel works reached its peak under his boss-ship, and at that point was making about 3 out of every 5 shovels in the world. Okay, yeah, you always think, no, well, they're making kitchenware. No, they're making shovels. And the blade, before it really looked like a shovel, was called a plate. There are train tracks on both sides of the storage bin, but this is the coolest part. The trains wouldn't come down here. What they would do would be to release their freight wagons up here and just let them roll down the hill. Up until the apartments were put in, there was a bumper here, and they would come down, hit the bumper, and stop. And then they could be offloaded on this embankment here. So there was raw material in the basement and finished products in the up above. So they tried to think out everything as much as they could.
The rail cars would roll down the hill, or what were they put in?
Yeah, rail cars would roll down. Yep.
Did they have tracks?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there were tracks all the way down to here.
I remember that.
Yep. Yeah, I remember it. We probably have pictures of it somewhere. One of the nice things about this project is the Beacon Company was so concerned about history that they took pictures of everything. So we have all the pictures of the changes. And some of the places where the Ameses cut corners, like roofs, they didn't spend a lot of time hooking the roof to the building. And the reason for that, it wasn't stupidity. The reason for that is that their hopes were that if there was ever another fire, the roof would burn, but the walls wouldn't crumble. And so that proved to be true, and that's why the design is the way it is. But now the roofs are hooked to the building. Not that they wouldn't still be much more fireproof than the way we build roofs today, but they're much more tied down.
Did have fires though?
Did they have fires? Yeah, the machine shop had a fire. The plate polishing shop burned. Long shop never did burn. The handle shop burned. So yeah, there were fires. As I said, Beacon Properties was really interested in preserving as much of the history as possible. And they were particularly interested in doing that when they discovered that most of the area around and under the buildings were these stones. It would have cost them thousands and thousands of dollars to haul the darn stones off the site. So they brought in a landscaper named Monique Hall, a landscape architect, who designed the architecture. So they ended up with leaving most of the stones. There is an embankment over here that has whatever they couldn't put around the buildings. But it's a very, very unusual and modern landscaping design, which is kind of cool since we're noted for our Frederick Law Olmsted landscapings to have something new and modern looking. So there's 113 apartments in this complex now, 83 different floor designs. Again, another, we don't want to make a lot of changes in the historic layout of these buildings from Beacon Properties. This is the long shop. It's called the long shop because it's 520 feet long, which is 1/10 of a mile long. It was designed to house most of the process of making shovels. We often say that Shovel Works was part of the development of the assembly line, which is the way most of our stuff is made now. Think Henry Ford with the Model T, and think how automobiles are made today. Step by step, the car is moved along the assembly line and put together. The Ameses never got quite that far. What they were actually developing was something called the American system, which if you had a teacher like me, you would unfortunately be confused with Henry Clay's American system, which said, build road and canals and, all of that sort of stuff, and have high tariffs. That's not it either, although the Ameses favored high tariffs. The American system was something that featured interchangeable parts and division of labor, okay? And originally, the Shovel Works didn't have interchangeable parts, and you could argue that even right up until almost the end, they didn't have interchangeable parts until they began stamping out shovel blades like the one I showed you, which are all identical. Each shovel blade looked pretty much the same, but they were handmade by somebody who knew what they were doing and used dies to get some uniformity, but not perfect uniformity. But they did develop division of labor. And so a whole bunch of different jobs were done in different places in this factory. That unfortunately prevented them from getting a really perfect flow through the factory system, because after you pounded the stuffing out of the big blades over there, they came over here to be pounded by other hammers that were very, very fast and much lighter than those over there, so that you could, smooth out the whole process. So those were pounding 480 times a minute. That's 6 times a second. It's a whole bunch of times a second. They were probably the most dangerous machines. Okay, they were run by belts that ran along the inside here, and the belts were something that could grab you and pull you up. We have horror stories of the textile girls in Lowell who had their hair grabbed and pulled up into the rafters and were scalped. That wasn't such a big thing for boys here, but you could get an arm crushed very, very easily in these machines. So they were all had to be on the first floor because they were still heavy, okay? And they were sort of the middle step in the process, and some of the other parts of the process were lighter. They didn't have heavy machines, and they were on the second floor. So there was some moving of the shovels back and forth that wouldn't be acceptable today in a regular assembly line, all right? We learned of another person saying about the same time as the boy that was killed today, back in 1850. A few years before, he had his hand crushed in one of the machines, and that was the making of him. He left the shovel works. He was, I guess, very bright, and so started a flour company. And it was up, if you've been driving around this winter, on the little farm that's owned by the town where the sheep were. There were hundreds of sheep there. Well, he had a flower garden there, and Mrs. Oakes Ames, tells the story about going to visit him, and he knew all the scientific names for the flowers, and they bought flowers from him and all that sort of stuff, which was great. Well, the kid was really smart, and when the Taunton Public Library was looking for a head librarian, he became one of the first head librarians in Taunton. That tells you something about the shovel works. There was a fairly high turnover of workers, but many of them stayed in the area and made something of themselves. The boy that I was telling you about who wrote the diary became our first journalist and wrote for the papers around here. Was a big friend of the Ameses, even though he was, as far as we can tell, a shovel worker. He didn't even make it to like managing a section like many of the old Yankees did. The workers in this building by the 1850s were about 2/3 Irish and 1/3 Yankee. And that was a problem for old Oliver. Old Oliver liked working with people that were like himself because, you know, Yankees are industrious and sober, don't forget sober. And the Irish were different. And the sobriety issue was a problem because the Ameses had early, before the Irish even showed up, become very prominent in the Massachusetts temperance movement. So they didn't want their workers to drink, and there's all sorts of things in the diaries about conflicts about that. But on the other hand, the young boys, Oakes and Oliver, the sons of the founder, realized that they couldn't run the shovel works with just old Yankees. So the Irish came in, and the supervisory jobs seems to have stayed with the Yankees until the turn of the century, when the Irish folks took over those jobs, and the Swedish folks became the regular everyday workers. And the problem came when the last wave of Easton's immigration showed up, the Portuguese. And there was a strike, a wildcat strike, when somebody in the office over here decided they were going to promote a Portuguese guy to a supervisory job. That caused a wildcat strike. So the workers were always interesting and boisterous, and they lived in a lot of the houses around here. We'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, it was a tough job. It was hot. It was dangerous, and there was a relatively high turnover. Particularly among the Irish, who had obviously many opportunities to go to other places in the country and get a job. They could build railroads for the Ameses if they wanted. So that's it. So 520 feet long. You can imagine some poor soul has to walk back and forth all day, 520 feet, and that's why they set this up the way that it did. And there's a hole in the middle, so let's go take a look at that. I used to bring second graders around, and I said, you know, why do they have a door up there? Oh, we could jump out. Yeah, great. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful idea. And then why is it there? Oh, it's a fire escape. No, the train would come in, and this is where the finished shovels were stored. They'd open the door, run a little slide out, and just load the trains from the second floor. But it's pretty cool. You'll see these all over the place. The diamond shapes that you see there are reinforcements for the floor. They're an iron rod that runs through the wooden floor. So even though there wasn't heavy machinery up there, dozens of shovels weighed a lot. Those are original, yes, sir. Yep. We're one of the few places in the world where shovels were sold by the dozen, like donuts. That's, oh yeah, we made 110,000 this year. Yeah, okay, nice. No, 110,000 dozen shovels. So across the way on Shovel Shop Pond is where the original shovel factory was. There wasn't a railroad here until 1855, so that's 50 years after the shovel works got started. Before that time, the shovels were all carried out by wagon, and they would go to Boston, and they would go to Taunton. And the reason they would go to Taunton is, first of all, it had railroads. Second of all, it was a port, so you could put shovels on a ship and ship them all over the place. By the time that we got a railroad here, we were selling shovels all across the country, particularly for the gold rush. And you may have heard that Ames shovels were used like money. And they were valued at a certain amount, and you could trade a shovel for food, or you could trade a shovel for even gold if you wanted to. And we were lucky enough, there was a steamship that blew up and sank in one of the rivers of California, and they did an archaeological dig. So we have actual pictures of these gold rush shovels, which don't look as much like what you can see at the Historical Society as you might imagine. So if you go on the tour next week, which is a little bit longer as far as walking distance, we'll talk about how all of this stuff fits together and makes Northeastern the most unique industrial village in Massachusetts, because all the original stuff is here. The workers' house, the factory, the gifts of the plutocrats, and the gifts of the plutocrats were the Ameses say, Yankees, they're well educated, they're sober, so we're going to spend money on schools and churches and stuff like that, and libraries. So it was not necessarily paternalistic. It was, hey, we succeeded this way, maybe other people can as well. So it's not a bad deal. Just to finish the other important part of the second grade tour, this is where all the poop for Northeastern goes. So poop is very important for young people. And if you get too close to it some days, you'll be able to figure that out. But that's what was used to be known as the Glass House. It's the last building that was put up here. And it actually was part of an assembly line because it had a single track railroad, monorail, like at Disney World, where the shovels would be moved along the track on the inside ceiling. It's now the garage. All right, this is a Antrim hammer shop, and actually Antrim opening shop. The Antrim process produced the top level shovel for the 19th and early 20th century for the Ameses. So they devoted 2 full buildings to it. And this is where the shovel straps were welded to the shovel blades. This is the engine house. This is where the steam engine was put when this building was constructed. And it was a coreless steam engine, which was top of the line for those days. But it was one of those ones that rocked back and forth, sort of like the cylinders of a car going up and down, up and down, up and down, which provided plenty of power for the belts that ran through here. The problem is in 1903, they began to electrify the property. And one of the first things they did was put in electric lights so that they could work longer hours, have a third shift. And the problem with that is that every time the arm went up, the electric current dropped. So the lights were going on and off all the time. So that was not going to work. And that led to the development over here of this little building here, which was put in 1907, is the powerhouse. And this provided a modern generator that made the electricity like we're used to today. Okay. Something that you all should look into, I should look into it too, is the Ameses were involved in the development of General Electric. And they were involved in what's known today as the current wars between Thomas Alva Edison, who was in favor of DC current, and Tesla and Westinghouse, who were in favor of alternating current. And the shovel works were electrified in 1903, sort of after this was just settled. But before that, several of the Ames mansions had their own electrical generators. And it would be fun to find out whether they were Edison generators or not. Why would it be fun? Because Brockton was one of the very first towns in America, cities in America, to be electrified. And it was electrified by Edison. Okay. So we're play a big part in that history as well. I used to tell my students that they couldn't come up with anything that I couldn't find in Ames that was involved in it. And it's pretty true, actually, even today. The family is widespread and involved in a lot of things. All right, we're nearing the end of the tour for those who are thinking abandon hope while you follow along. So let's go over here. On the right here, this concrete block building is the laboratory. And one of the things that distinguishes the Ames family is that throughout the time that they ran the shovel works, they were always experimenting to make better steel, to make better processes. And that was a real plus. They were very active that way. And most of the bosses, Oaks, Anger Ames, and some of the even later Ameses had patents on various processes, and they encouraged their workers to develop patents as well. So it's a good deal. My biggest impact on the Beacon project, they chained it up so I can't ring the bell anymore. We used to come through a little bit too early in the morning, I guess, and ring the bell. It's a beautiful bell. It's the second oldest bell still in Easton. There's a bell in the condominium on Mechanic Street, the old church there, and the church bell stayed there, but that's the oldest bell. This is the second oldest bell from 1853. When the machine shop was finished, they put this up on top. And yeah, you can, even a little second grader, if it wasn't chained up, could make the bell ring. It's pretty cool. And it weighs a lot of stuff. So this gives me a chance to talk about the working hours. Let's say that you were a shovel handler. You were one of the guys that was going to be putting shovels to wooden handles. Back in the 1840s, you could make 25 cents a dozen to do that. And if you worked really hard, you could maybe make 20 dozen shovels in a day. Okay? So you can figure out the math on that. So seems like a lot of work for a little return. But the people that did that were generally very happy with it. And that was fine. But the way that the work originally went was, if you wanted to work, you showed up. And if you didn't want to work, you didn't show up. That didn't mean you were fired. It meant you could come another day. And one of the geniuses of old Oliver and his sons was that they could figure out, okay, if Joe shows up, we'll do this. If Peter shows up, we'll do that. And, and they could make this crazy thing work. Well, the boys finally got sick of that. And in 1843, when they took over, when old Oliver allegedly retired, the boys remained terrified of him for the rest of his life. That was another 20 years. So they were very careful to innovate. Is Dad away? Okay, let's try this. They put in regular working hours. So in 1943, the regular working hours became 7 in the morning till 6 at night, with an hour off in the middle, where you could go home and get lunch or eat lunch here. So it was a 12-hour day. The Ameses were pretty good at realizing that was a tough deal. And so they were among the very first companies in America to support the 10-hour working day. So the guys in the factory got a 10-hour day. Well, that meant that the guys who worked on the Ames farm, because don't forget, the way you made money was to sell food to your workers. And you have credit. Well, we don't even have to pay you. Just have credit at the store. And those workers said, we have to work from dawn till dusk like farmers. Can't we have a 10-hour day like everybody else? They struck, all got fired. And it was a while before they got a 10-hour day. That was that story. This bell would ring 15 minutes before 7, 6:45, to let people know that it was time to come to work. It could be heard all over Northeastern, and then it would ring at about 5:45 to let them know it was time to head out for the day. And by the way, the hours would vary. In the wintertime, they would be short. There'd be shorter hours because originally this was candlelit, believe it or not. And then finally, what happened was, what did happen? Oh yeah, around 9 o'clock, the bell would ring again. That was the curfew bell. And if you were tired or hungover, you probably shouldn't be working with heavy machinery. So the Ameses encouraged everybody to be off the street and in bed by 9 o'clock, okay? Which wasn't unreasonable for, again, a town that was lit only by candlelight. And a town that was eventually so cheap that when we had gas light, the gas lighter would go around and light the lights by hand. And he would only do that on nights when there wasn't a full moon. Because when there was a full moon, there was plenty of light for you to see. We don't need to light those. So there was a little frugality there. Almost. So you can get an idea, this whole wall of this building used to be glass. The ceiling used to be, it was a giant greenhouse. And it had wings on the top that were opened up for air circulation. So I think it got pretty hot in the summertime. What you're looking at here is the last water wheel, and that was buried pretty much where we were. Oh, actually not. The channel ran under the building and was inside the machine shop. So this was still in use when the shovel shop closed in 1952. Now, what we did was we have pictures of the wooden paddles that came out that were attached. So we took those off and put this extra special rust preventative, which has worked really well. It's been over a decade and there's no rust on these things. But it's a giant water wheel. It's a pretty good size. It was buried in a pit there, and one of our historians went through the pit to see what the heck was going on in there and was really surprised to see this. So the Ameses never, ever gave up on water power. It was always there if they needed it. And this is the gear that would carry the power from the wheel to the factory machines. Over here is the Millie Packard house. Now, it really shouldn't be the Millie Packard house because it was built by her future husband 2 years before they got married, but they wouldn't listen to me. His name was Tilson Packard, and I wanted them to name the house the Millie and Tilly house, but they didn't. Tilson died fairly soon, and Millie was left a widow. So what she did is before the factory came over here, she took in boarders who worked at the shovel company. And that was all fine. You know, all the noise was on the other side of the pond. And then they came to her one day, you know, the thing burned down and we're not going to build on the island anymore. We're going to come over here, right next to your house. So she was at an age, she sold out, and this became an Ames tenement. As many as 10 shovel workers at a time would be living in this little tiny house, okay? And you can go in there on weekends. It's our cultural center, and the original stoves and stairways and stuff are still in there. It's a good take if you like that at all. And then the last thing that I'm going to show you, look, I keep my promises. That's why I can't run for office, is the building that looks like a Tudor guild hall, which is all fake, by the way. As I pointed out, the Ameses always had oxen on site, and they all, if you wanted to get someplace fast, you didn't use an ox. So they also had horses. in there. They always needed a stable, and the stable was there. At least one time it burned down, and they decided to build this building here, which is called the stable. It's in Tudor Revival style, but the wood that you see on the second floor, which in a real Tudor Revival house would actually be real beams, those are appliques. I just stuck them on. This was designed by the same people that did the original sheep pasture mansion. So ultimately what happened is they put the shovel company offices on the second floor above the stables. There's a big safe in there that they would store some of their patents in. And this is the first place that women worked on the shovel company, because they were there when the idea of a secretary transformed from being a guy to being either gender. So that's the first place that women worked on the thing. I don't know how they felt about being above the oxen, but they were there. And then finally, it was moved away to Boston. The offices was in one of the Ames buildings in Boston. And then in 1928, when this building was built and the system was revised, the office came back here and finished up as well. So some of the material that is in the Stonehill collection of industrial archives comes from that building, and some of it comes from the storeroom building. And we were lucky that the person who owned this after the Ameses gave out was a man named Arnold Tophius, who was a person who bought abandoned factories and used them for warehouses and things like that. So the buildings were preserved. Mr. Tophius donated all the records of the company to Stonehill College. And so again, speaking of how complete things are, we have the records of the company, we have the buildings, we have the workers' housing, we have a book that shows who rented what house from the Ameses and how much they paid. We have all that detail. If anybody ever has 3 more lives, like I don't have, there's a lot more to be done about the history of Easton. Because, yeah, the Ameses were wonderful, absolutely fantastic. As far as owners of a big property, they did a great job of supporting their community and still support their community. There's 3 Ames brothers that are associated with the town now. David Ames, the oldest of them, is associated with Frothingham Park. Bill Ames is on the library board, and Fred Ames is the president, I believe, of the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall. So they're still there working behind the scenes mostly, but they did a good job. But it was the people, we the people, who made the shovels, okay? And they deserve to be recognized as well. Generations of folks, Irish immigrants, Swedish immigrants, Portuguese immigrants. There were some English immigrants and Scottish immigrants as well. Poor Mr. Loftus, who died on the 14th of August, who was a Scottish immigrant. So there's many, many stories to tell. And I'm glad you took the opportunity to come and spend your time here today.